Greetings, this is Dr. Craig Chalkwist. I'm Department Chair of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and an advisor and consultant at several other schools. And I'm creating this video because I get asked a question a lot, and I'd like to address it to a wide audience. And the question is there any reason for hope, given everything that we're facing in terms of climate change, mass extinction, and all the other ecological disasters that are piling down on us right now? I think there is. And so what I'd like to do actually is talk about the psychology of hope and hopelessness. That tends to be a cultural blind spot, especially here in the States. And then what I want to do is I want to give you a list of reasons that I feel hopeful. These reasons occurred to me kind of after the fact. Perhaps I'm optimistic by nature, I don't know. But even though my job requires staying on top of all the latest depressing environmental news, there's some sense that I have that we can pull through somehow. And, you know, we're not going to have the kind of planet that we used to live on. That's gone, actually. We have to be realistic about that. Many species are gone too, and it could be that ours will follow them. But nevertheless, I think there are things to look forward to, and I want to talk about that a bit. So, if you follow the environmental news, you know that the situation that we're in is not just bad, it's actually dire. The oceans are dying. They're acidifying, and they'll be dead within perhaps 20 to 30 years. If the science that we're looking at is accurate. Plants and animals are disappearing at more than 100 times their natural extinction rate. And we can't live without ourselves, even if we were so selfish that we didn't care about them. The planet's overheating, oceans are rising. We're looking forward to resource wars, fighting over what fossil fuels remain, shortages of fresh water, and it just goes on and on. There was a study in 2013, a prediction that most of the world's capital cities would have to be evacuated within 40 years, not because of rising oceans, but because of rising heat. And so there's a lot of really depressing news. And it's news that we have to be aware of if we wish our hope, if there is any hope to be had from all this, to be realistic. So, I want to talk a little bit about the results of hopelessness, and I should add at this point, I tried to create this presentation in Keynote, and I wasn't able to do it. The audio wouldn't take, and so what I've done is I've actually created a separate audio track, and I'm dumping all this into iMovie. And so because I'm a novice at using iMovie, the slides that you're seeing aren't going to line up really well with what I'm saying, but at least you'll have both, and you can rewind if you need to. And I just want to say thanks also to the music in the background that you might be hearing from the artist Gandalf. I actually looked him up on the internet today, and he kind of looks like Gandalf, so that's kind of neat. But anyway, thank you again. If you're listening to this, thank you, Gandalf, for this beautiful music in the background. So, hopelessness. Well, there's a hell of a thing, as Jung would have put it. There are quite a few voices these days, both inside and outside the environmental movement, that are saying that we should just give up hope. We should just stop hoping that things could be better. As a depth psychologist, I have to disagree. The usual results of hopelessness include passivity, sense of helplessness, a refusal to act or feel responsible for what's going on or alleviating it in any way, isolation, resentment, and destroyed visions of the better world that we actually could have. There is a small group of people who can live without hope. And that's fine for them. This isn't a prescription. I'm not saying what should or shouldn't be psychologically. But what I am observing is that for the overwhelming majority of us, if we have no sense of hope, if we don't think things can get better, they won't. And we won't work to make them so. So, exactly what is hope? I remember hearing the late James Hillman, the Jungian analyst, talk about this. I wish we could have actually had a conversation about it. I knew Hillman myself, and for some reason it never came up between the two of us, but Hillman often felt that hope was hopeless. He thought it was an error, a danger, and he would say, hope takes us away from what is. It deludes us. It makes us think that things are actually better than they are, and I think it can, but there's a crucial distinction that's not being made here psychologically between genuine hope and false hope. That's a huge blind spot, and it's really important to understand what that's about. So, hope, if you look it up in the dictionary, it says to desire with expectation of obtainment. And also, in some languages, and I'm thinking especially of Espanol, the word for hope, esperar, to hope, also means to wait for something and to expect something. And so for me, psychologically, genuine hope is actually a forward-looking anticipation of what could be that's better than what we have right now, and what should be that's better than what we have right now. So I've included in these slides a quotation from the great American poet Emily Dickinson. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So, false hope, in a way, it always partakes of denial. And denial is a refusal to face up to how bad things really are. Things can't be this way. We can't be extinguishing ourselves as a species. We can't be wiping out so many other species. It's just not possible. It just wouldn't be permitted. That's what denial sounds like. Denial also sounds like this, that if we just think better and think hopefully and whistle past the graveyard, then that'll automatically make things better. It usually makes things worse, actually. And as a psychotherapist, I often worked with domestic violence victims and survivors. And one of the things that characterized the victim as opposed to the survivor was the victim would say, well, I don't think the violence was really him. I say him because something like 98% of domestic violence is perpetrated by men. That's a fact that as men we have to face up to, guys. It's not really who he was, and blah, blah, blah. Well, all that may be true, but it functions as denial. It keeps somebody in an unsafe situation. I heard a lot of that. And denial is not something that's specific to victims of domestic violence. We all do it. It's a defense that we all make use of. And there's a form that it takes sometimes in American culture in particular, where I think of it as techno-redemption, where we think that our inventions will save us. Someday somebody will invent something that pulls the extra carbon out of the atmosphere or that duplicates photosynthesis or what have you. And now these are real possibilities. I'm not talking about the content of this expectation. There was some research, it must have been about a month ago, where scientists actually duplicated one of the key steps of photosynthesis. Amazing. That could happen. We could invent our way out of it, but that's not the point psychologically. The point is giving up our power to the belief that that's how things will work out. That keeps us, like Hillman would say, that keeps us, from really getting busy in the present. That takes us away from what's actually happening now. So false hope, denial, positive thinking with quote marks around the positive. The idea that somebody else will take care of everything, you're leaving it up to the experts, very disempowering. And false hope, basically, if you wanted to sum it up psychologically, it takes the child position. It says we're helpless, we have to lean on other people to make things happen and hope that it works out. So that's false hope. In contrast to realistic hope. Realistic hope realizes, first of all, that giving up is much easier than hoping, especially these days when you read all this bad news. The position of the cynic and the doomer is emotionally advantageous in many ways. You don't have to feel responsible. You don't have to get busy about doing anything. And you actually protect yourself from the disappointment that comes from having your hope shattered. And so, in some ways, cynicism about hope is similar to cynicism about love. We've all met people that give up on love. No, it's always false. It's always projection. It's always idealization of the partner, that sort of thing. And so that kind of thinking protects us and keeps our feelings from being hurt again. Even though in the long run we actually lose a great deal when we indulge in that kind of activity. So realistic hope. Knowing up front that giving up is actually easier than hoping. Acknowledging the difficulties fully. So really facing the facts. Really facing where we are and how we got here. That's part of realistic hope. So is realizing that what we've wounded, we can make better. We can heal. Perhaps not all of it, but a lot of it. And a statement that I like that for me sums up realistic hope is the statement, it doesn't have to be this way. There's a distinction that Joanna Macy makes that I really respect. Joanna Macy's been, for decades, introducing people to eco-grief and helping them work through that. She's written books about this too, and she has a book actually called Active Hope. And so the distinction that she makes between passive and active hope is, with passive hope, we're actually waiting for external agencies to make a change, so similar to what we just talked about. We're waiting to feel hopeful before we act. That's liable to be a long wait. And it's something that we have, passive hope, rather than something that we choose to do. By contrast, in active hope, the emphasis is on what we can do. So a clear view of reality, identifying where we need to go, taking steps to actually get there, removing blocks to action and intention. And we can do this even when we feel hopeless, and we all have days like that. There are some days I read the environmental news and I think we are screwed, and that's just my mood for the evening or whenever it is that I read the news. But it doesn't stop me from acting. So I want to mention, too, actually for the benefit of Jungians and depth psychologists and people with that kind of background, I believe that hope is actually archetypal. There's a goddess in Greek mythology called Elpis. Her name is Hope. And she has sisters in other pantheons, too, in other cultures. I think hope is, to say it differently, it's an inbuilt perspective. It's a dimension of being. And it's something that we can be in dialogue with, rather than something that we just can dismiss as always being false. So with that, I'd like to give you my short list of things to be hopeful about. It's a short list. I could double it, but here's the smaller version. And this is not in any order, it's just off the top of my head. But reason number one, in the slide I put, never give up and expect the unexpected. It's important to realize when the science tells us that we're headed down the wrong path, it's important to realize that we need to take that seriously. We need to hear people who are actually out in the field doing this work, the experts, the real experts on this, the ones who measure the melting ice caps and who take the core samples and who measure the carbon content in the atmosphere and all the rest of it. We need to understand that they mean what they say and they've got solid reasons for saying what they do. And at the very same time, any good scientist will tell you that science is not about certainties. It's about collecting as much information as we can, striking out in new directions, studying the cosmos in a systematic way. But science is not about ever coming to totally firm conclusions. The next finding can always change things. And so we live as part of an ecological Earth system that is far more complex, we're learning, than we had ever thought. And we're part of that system. So we will probably never fully understand it because we are a part of that system. Think about the branch trying to understand the tree, let alone the ecosystem that the tree sits in. So we have to approach all of this with a sense of humility and expectation of surprises and realize that even when things look dire, anything can happen. Anything can change. And so in the slide that I put this on there, I included a picture of John Muir. He's kind of my patron saint of the unexpected because he was not only a great naturalist, but there was an event where he found himself at the top of an avalanche, and the whole mountain that he was standing on, the whole side of the mountain was sliding downhill. So I think that any objective observer of his situation at the moment this occurred would have concluded that he is doomed. What did Muir do? He surfed the avalanche downhill. Can you imagine that? He went with it. He got on top of it and he just kind of surfed it downhill. When it finished, he got up and he walked away from it. I don't think anyone could have predicted that, least of all him. And this was somebody too who had a certain amount of luck. I mean, he would survive in the Sierra, severe lightning storms from the top of pine trees, and there was something in Muir that told him that he was going to be safe, even though he was in situations that the rest of us might not have gotten through. And so I like that as an example of how you just can't tell. When I was younger, I had this weird period of my life where I kept getting into really dangerous situations. I've had guns pointed at me. I have confronted mass murderers and done all kinds of risky, dangerous, foolish things. And several times I was in situations, like I'm thinking of one where I pulled an ex-girlfriend out of a cave-in. I rushed in and got her about 1 second before the entire cave collapsed. And this isn't heroism. I think a lot of people who are listening to this can have, probably everybody can have examples from their own lives where they did something risky and it worked out. Or you had a near miss of some kind. You almost got hit by that car, or you almost got hit by that bolt of lightning, or whatever it was. It's something that's fairly common. We live in an uncertain universe. Nothing heroic about it. And so what that taught me was never give up. Never lose hope that things can be different. Because if you give up in some situations, you are done. Now, by extension of the same principle of not giving up, human beings as a species, we've survived amazing odds. If you look at our history, just amazing. I always thought that there was something quite appropriate about the fact that millions of years ago there was a massive plume of magma underneath Ethiopia, and it came to the surface of the planet and it created the Rift Valley, and that was the cradle of all of us. We all come from East Africa, and there's something appropriate about that, don't you think? Human beings are born out of rupture, out of planetary rupture. There's something in us that recognizes it and how to deal with it. And so thousands of years ago, there was something called the Toba disaster, Toba. There was a big volcano that exploded in Sumatra, and the world was plunged in a global winter. Crops failed all over the place. And many species got thinned out, including ours. So when you look at us genetically, human beings are less genetically diverse than many other species because all of us go back to that 2,000 or 3,000 hardy people who survived the Toba disaster. We're all family related very closely to each other because of those folks. And they didn't survive on their own, by the way. They didn't survive buying guns and holing up somewhere. They survive by cooperating. That's what we do as a species. We're family. So now, an ecologist pointed out to me once, well, sure, global winter, or nuclear winter, if we make that mistake, that's easier to survive than heat. And that's true. We do better in winter and in snow and in ice and those sorts of conditions than we do in situations of extreme heat. But I think that observation misses the larger point, which is never to underestimate the human capability for adapting to change. And that makes me hopeful. Another reason, we have tended to think of ourselves as separate and above nature, separate from and above nature. That's James Hillman, who I mentioned before, refers to that as a thought disorder. We can't be separate from nature, and a big part of the problems that we face have to do with the idea that we are separate from nature somehow. We are an expression of nature's infinite creativity, diversity, development in the sense of making new things happen, not in the sense of paving things over, which is a kind of, as Vandana Shiva calls it, a monoculture of the mind. We are the creativity of nature in some ways, in uniquely human ways, and I think that that's hopeful too. So, as one of many examples of that, there's a relatively new field called biomimicry, and in YouTube, Janine Benyus, the field biologist Janine Benyus, talks a lot about biomimicry. She's got some really good presentations about this, and she wrote a book about it too. And biomimicry means the idea that we replace the attitude of master of nature with the attitude of being mentored by nature. And so we're doing things like using the basic pattern of a termite mound in order to create tall buildings, because a termite mound is structurally superior and more resilient than the best skyscrapers that we can create. And Janine Benyus also asks questions like, how is it that a spider can weave web material that, per unit, is hundreds of times stronger than steel, but without blast furnaces? She just does it in her own body at normal body temperature. How in the world is that possible? So we're learning to, some of us anyway, we're learning to be mentored by nature and to align with the natural cycles and processes of nature in order to make things that last. Another example of this would be permaculture, which is the design of food systems and the ways that nature does things. So as a specific example of that, we're all used to, those of us in industrial countries, we're all used to monocrops, which means you grow one of the same thing in straight rows. Nature would never do that for a lot of obvious reasons, one of which is if a pest comes along who likes that crop, you've lost the whole thing. What nature does, by contrast, is grows things in guilds, grows things diversely. And so there might be several different things that are all growing together that like each other and support each other. So that seems like a much more intelligent and survivable way to make food than exhausting soils and leaving crops open to predators. Another reason for hope, the affinity for life and growth and greenery and nature, which biologist E.O. Wilson referred to as biophilia, love of life, seems to be built into us. And it can be overlaid by cultural attitudes that make it hard to manifest, but we can get it back. So at one point, for part of my master gardener training, I helped maintain a garden, a volunteer garden, in back of the Contra Costa Times building here in California. And sometimes we would have children show up in our garden. They would be brought by teachers or by their parents. Many of them had never been near soil before, remarkably. They had grown up in very urban or suburban environments, and they were afraid to touch the soil because they had been taught that it was dirty. And so what we observed was that attitude wears off in about 5 seconds. You know, if you sit with a child and you say, all right, we're going to plant something today, and what we're going to do first is we're going to get to know the soil by touching it, and then you plunge your own hands into the soil, and you get nice and dirty, and you talk about how good it feels and all that. The kids will just follow right along. I mean, after maybe a momentary hesitation. So we had lots of soil-covered kids leaving that garden at the end of the day. It was fantastic. And by doing that, they learn to love plants and love animals and love nature. And if you talk to any, for instance, naturalist or environmental activist or nature artist, anybody who advocates for earth-honoring practices, they will all tell you that in childhood they had some pivotal experience that made nature's closeness apparent and valuable and lovable to them. Something we can all learn. There's also a lot of research coming out about how renewing our contact with nature on a conscious level makes us healthier, physically, psychologically, maybe spiritually too. Linda Bizzell and I published an anthology with Sierra Club Books called Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature and Mind. A lot of chapters written by people that actually make an active practice of reintroducing nature. And as a small example of that, so, I mean, there's things like, green walks, going for a walk through a countryside. It lowers your anxiety. It boosts your immunity. It elevates your mood and a number of other things. There's a lot of research about that. But to be more specific, so there's a soil bacteria called Mycobacterium bacchae, and there's studies about how it can alleviate anxiety and depression. It can make your brain cells grow. Might alleviate asthma, even cancer. And the way you get access to it, simply by touching fresh soil. So if you're walking through an area where things are growing in the soil and you just pick up a handful and you carry it for 20 minutes, see if you start feeling different. See if you start feeling kind of a natural high from that. Another reason for hope, the last 10 to 15 years in interspecies communication research has killed the idea that human beings have an intelligence that's not shared by any other species, that we're unique in our communication, our inner life, our sense of ethics. We know that's not true anymore. We know that primates actually, and I'm thinking of elephants especially, they remember when loved ones have passed on. They come back to the same spots where their loved ones have died, and they lower their ears and stand in a circle. And, in human terms, that's a funeral. Mark Bekoff, in his wonderful book, The Emotional Lives of Animals, talks about many different examples of this. He's a cognitive ethologist, so he's an expert on animal consciousness. We know that dolphins speak in dialects, and in many parts of the world, dolphins actually help human fishers, and so there's a cooperative relationship going on. We know that crows and ravens pick up nuts and drop them in intersections in order to crack the shell, but they watch the lights. Isn't that amazing? They watch the lights, so they know when to do it and not get hit by the traffic. Human researchers have taught sign language to apes, bonobos, gorillas, and actually exchanged meaningful communications. That's really an exchange of culture, isn't it? So there's many things that tell us that we are not alone on this planet, that we don't have to be in the, quote, heroic posture of feeling thrown into nature and aliens in a universe that is uncaring and all the rest of it. We're in good company here. And when you understand that, it makes you want to make that company continue and do what you can to preserve it. Another reason for hope. It's amazing to me how often my students have nature dreams, and animals, plants, even landscapes, even Earth show up in the dreams of these students. This is going to be, it's hard to understand the significance of this if you don't work with dreams a lot. Dreams tend not to show you what you already know. If you think that a dream is simple or easy, you probably don't understand it. Dreams actually, they bring back to you at night what you don't look at, what you need to have presented to you, what you underestimate, what you screen out of your daily consciousness. And so the fact that so much of nature and the planet continue to speak to human beings in our dreams, that is hopeful to me. It tells me that, in some sense, our partners in the natural world are continuing to reach out to us. They're continuing to show up for us. And, on our side of things, something in the human unconscious, both personal and collective, responds to that and says, we need to heed this call. I don't think that would be the case if the situation was hopeless. I mentioned the Toba disaster earlier and how probably, undoubtedly, we got through it by being with each other. So human beings tend to do well in face-to-face circles if they're well facilitated, and if the people who join the circle have a good intention and are open to learning new communication skills. It seems to be a basic pattern that we always fall back on whenever we get in trouble, and it goes by many different names. A political name would be, a cell of revolution. Bellhooks has written about public home places, the small mini communities that black women used in order to get through slavery and support each other through it. There's many different names for this basic human form. I call it heartsteading, as opposed to homesteading, which requires land. Heartsteading you can do anywhere. But it makes me hopeful when you get people together that new opportunities and forms of wisdom and sources of information can emerge from that. I have an almost limitless optimism that a group that's properly facilitated can solve almost any problem. I think the era of the lone genius who's going to figure out the world for us is over. And I'm not sure it ever worked that well to begin with. Now, there are a lot of organizations around us that are fighting for ecological justice, fighting against climate change. There's the Earth Charter Initiative, which I recommend looking up, by the way. It's a basic blueprint for how to live in peace and justice on this planet in ways that make sense. So there's all kinds of things happening. There's new platforms, new movements, new ways of looking at the world, always authors publishing new books on how to do things differently. Many different experiments going on around the world. And it's important to realize, too, that when people sometimes thoughtlessly say, we need solutions, we actually probably don't, because they're probably out there already. Somebody's probably doing it already, and it just needs to be scaled up. How to have a genuinely democratic form of culture and society, or how to live sustainably on the earth, or how to have restorative justice in a community so it's not all about the police and the courts. I mean, these and many other things are already being done. It's really just a matter of finding out where and how they're working. So many different solutions out there, many different answers, and they're not all technological, but some of them are. There are answers at many different levels, and I kind of like it that our word for solution, it echoes an alchemical term, and alchemy is usually thought of as a failed attempt to make gold, but in reality, alchemy for many hundreds of years was a wisdom tradition, and as Jung showed us, is full of deep wisdom and psychology. And so alchemy knew an operation called solutio, and you use solutio to wash things. It's an application of moisture to something that's dry and rigid, and so it loosens it up. So when we think about solutions, we can think about loosening up a customary way of attacking a problem. We can think about moistening an attitude that perhaps has served us in the past but doesn't serve us anymore. There's been some debate about Earth as a whole, as a symbol. In 1968, the Apollo 8 mission sent back to us that photograph of Earth rising behind the moon. Their first reaction to that was aesthetic. They thought it was beautiful, which is interesting. I tend to think that Earthrise and Earth itself are announcing a new turn in collective consciousness, a new beacon. And it's possible to look at Earth as a place to map and conquer and all that. But I think there's a bigger message, and you can see it in things like the overview effect, which is the astronauts' term for when they go up to the International Space Station and they walk by a window and they see Earth. And they're so struck by the beauty of Earth that they just stop and forget what they're doing. All the astronauts know about this. And there have been many very moving accounts written by astronauts who have come under the spell of the beauty of Earth seen from orbit. One astronaut from India mentions that you don't have to undertake space flight to come by this. Many of us have a sense of awe and beauty down here. But it really is stirring to read their accounts. There was an astronaut, I believe, from Syria who said on the first day up, we were all pointing at our countries. There's my country, there's your country, and so on. On the second day up, we were pointing at our continents. And on the third day, there was only one Earth for all of us. And then Taylor Wang, a Chinese-American astronaut, said that in Chinese folklore, there's a story about a wise and beautiful princess who was set upon by robbers one day, and they intended to take all her jewelry and cut the rings from her fingers. But when they saw how wise and beautiful she was, they immediately changed their intention and decided instead to become her protectors. And Taylor Wang says, That's how I felt when I saw the Earth from space for the very first time. So I would like to offer that images of Earth give us a beacon, an emblem, an image, something to say, we are here, we are consciously trying to do better. We're one of many species, and this is our home. So maybe it's a signal for homecoming as adults who come back home with a new sense of appreciation. And additionally, as Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, Evelyn Tucker, and a number of other people have pointed out, we've got a new story. Science has helped us. It's not complete, but it's helped us understand our place in the cosmos. And so there's a new sense of enchantment that's available. We don't have to live in a dead universe of, what was it Whitehead called it, heaps of matter. We don't have to live in a world of mechanisms anymore. We can live in an ensouled universe where everything is animated and beautiful and alive. Thomas Berry said, the reason that things are so catastrophic is because our stories are broken. The stories that have served us up until now aren't adequate to the time anymore. We need new stories. And so the function of the storyteller in human culture immediately comes to the forefront with an entirely new importance. If we can tell ourselves good stories about why we're here, about how nature speaks to us, about the beauty of the cosmos, we can actually regain a sense of everything as spiritually informed, as reaching out to us. We can have a sense that inner and outer are not really separate anymore. This is possible for our time now, and that makes me hopeful. And as part of all of this, to kind of sum it up, it often seems to me that the crises that are barreling down on us are of our own making, in the sense that men in my men's groups, I worked with the courts for a while. Most of the male clients that I had been arrested for violent crimes. And they came to us for mandatory therapy. And it occurred to me at one point, early in my career at doing that the men had set themselves up. That sometimes when we aren't reflective, we bring down disaster on ourselves specifically to wake up. It's an unconscious motive, but it's powerful, and it forces us to live differently. And so, in many ways, by overheating the planet, we've turned it into an alchemical crucible that's cooking all of us. We have to get it right now. There's no longer a choice about that. So, maybe this is the time where we get to finally grow up as a species. Dwayne Elgin goes around the world and he asks audiences, if you could pick among let's see if I can get this right, 4 different developmental levels, as though all of humanity were one organism trying to grow up, which one of these would you pick? Is humanity in childhood, in adolescence, in adulthood, or elder, in old age? And Dwayne Elgin says, almost always people say adolescence. Now there's exceptions to that, and I think that, and this is a big generalization, but I'm going to stand by it, I think that indigenous cultures are our elders. The elders of the human species, which is why this is also a time of being able to appreciate what they've told us for so long and come back to those sources of wisdom with new eyes and a new heart. Be that as it may, it's characteristic of adolescence to be impulsive, to underestimate risks, to do dangerous things, and to sometimes be irresponsible. So if humanity, especially Western humanity, industrial humanity, is concluding along adolescence, then the obligation is clear. It's time to grow up. It's time to be responsible adults. Business as usual doesn't work anymore. Just looking out for me or my money or my government or my political party doesn't work anymore. We live in a bigger world than that, a bigger cosmos than that. And Earth, as Carl Sagan pointed out in his book Pale Blue Dot, Earth is where we have to make our stand right now. So what will it take for us to come of age as a species? That's a big question. Partly, I think we're helped by the fact that historically in times of apocalypse, and I don't mean apocalypse just as a religious fundamentalist fantasy. I mean it as catastrophe, worldwide catastrophe that goes on in many different cultures. It shows up in many different mythologies. Whenever you study it, either mythologically or historically, apocalypse seems to always have two phases. It begins with disaster. It begins with collapse. Everything falls apart. As the poet said, the center cannot hold. But then there's the upswing. There's the renewal phase. And so perhaps coming of age as a species means that we can bravely face, realistically face, the collapse of so many institutions and attitudes and worldviews while looking out for the possibilities of renewal. So I'd like to leave you with a few quotations, and I've got them in a slide here. The first one, all the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming. Helen Keller. Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. Desmond Tutu. Hope is important because it can make the present moment less difficult to bear. If we believe that tomorrow will be better, we can bear a hardship today. Thich Nhat Hanh. And then a last quote from Alice Walker. Life is better than death, I believe, if only because it's less boring and because it has fresh peaches in it. Difficult to argue with that. Thank you very much for listening to this.